My name is Kyle Roberts, and I'm the Executive Director of the Congregational Library and Archives. Welcome to today's virtual discussion with Dr. Tara Bynum to celebrate the release of her really fantastic new book, Reading Pleasures, Everyday Black Living in Early America. To begin with, I want to acknowledge that the Congregational Library and Archives resides in what is now known as Boston, which is in the place of the Blue Hills, the homeland of the Massachusetts people, whose relationships and connections with the land continue to this day and into the future. For those of you joining us for the first time, the Congregational Library and Archives is an independent research library. Established in 1853, the Congregational Library's mission is to foster a deeper understanding of the spiritual, intellectual, cultural, and civic dimensions of the congregational story and its ongoing relevance in the 21st century. We do this through free access to our research library of 225,000 books, pamphlets, periodicals, and manuscripts, as well as our digital archive, which has more than 100,000 images, many of them drawn from our New England's Hidden Histories project. Throughout the year, we offer educational programs like this one and research fellowships for students, scholars, churches, and anyone interested in Congregationalism's influence on the American story. Please do check out our website, congregationallibrary.org, to learn more about what we do and for news of forthcoming events. Now I'm going to go ahead and invite our speaker to come up. Dr. Tara Bynum is an assistant professor of English and African American studies and a scholar of early African American literary histories before 1800 at the University of Iowa. She received her PhD in English from the Johns Hopkins University and a BA in political science from Barnard College. Hey there, Tara. Thanks so much for being here.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. Thanks for the opportunity to talk about the book. And of course, thanks to you and to all the other folks who helped make this event possible. I appreciate it.
Well, maybe we start with the big picture. Where did this book come from?
Where did this book come from? I think that this is a book with many origin stories. I think that the kind of long arc of this book starts in graduate school for me, when I have the opportunity to learn basically that there's early African-American literature, and early African-American literature, I mean kind of before 1800. And it's more than Phillis Wheatley. There's a whole cast of authors and writers. And I learned this by way of the Evans digital database. That's what it was called at the time. And just remember this category, Blacks as authors. That's also what it was called at the time. And there were pages and pages and pages. And I got to wondering why I didn't know there was this writing. And also why, I wondered at some point why I was so surprised that there was this writing. And, the more I read from these early writers, the more I realized that there's a whole set of stories that I hadn't yet read about in kind of African-American literary criticism. There's a whole kind of perspective on the lives and the writings of these early writers that I took note of, and that's where the part about kind of pleasure becomes so important. It's like, what if I take seriously John Marrant and James Albert Ukawsaw Gronniosaw's faith? What if I take seriously that Wheatley is really excited to receive letters from her friend Uber Tanner? Or what if I also take seriously that there's something not only important about David Walker's rage, but also the vision of a happy country that David Walker has imagined? And I think that what emerged was a set of questions and the pursuit of answers to those questions that kind of got me a dissertation. But then I think after that, because it's been a long time since I defended that joker, after that, I think I became all the more interested in diving deeper, reading more closely, and paying more attention to the language of the writing itself. So I think that that's one of the origin stories of this book. And I think that, I realized pretty early that research is ultimately me search. I was like, I want to research something exciting. So like, why not research fun? Why not research pleasure? Why not research feeling good? You know?
Well, I think that's, I mean, there's so many things that origin story sort of brings up, right? In the way in which it was going back to the archive, the digital archive, right? Maybe then going through what had already been anthologized for you that might have changed your path. Also, so much the way in which these things need to cook over time, right?
Oh yeah. I think that the cooking process like also allows for, you know, I think sitting with the text itself and having the text offer, you know, kind of glimpses of itself. You know, I think that, you know, folks have kind of chastised me for writing in the present. I always use the present tense, but you know, my PhD is in English, not history. So I don't know what the past is because everything is present anyways, and living, you know, but I think that that actually really does inform my perspective on the text itself. And I think in some respects, like it allows for I think that the time allows for the engagement with the text and the emergence of new questions. And that I think is ultimately where like the archival space ends up being useful too, because it sometimes yields answers to those questions. And I also think sometimes it says, no, that's none of your business.
Yeah. We're going to get back to that question.
Ooh, I love
so
it.
important. So you're sitting with these texts, you know, you're sitting with them as a doctoral student, you're sitting with them as a faculty member, you're sitting with them as an educator. And I want to come back to you as educator. Pleasure. So how did pleasure rise to the top, you know, and where does pleasure live? Maybe I'm asking too many questions, but where do you feel like you had been told pleasure lived? And where did you discover pleasure living in the early American Black South?
Well, you know, I think that I kind of made the error that I might suggest my students make sometimes, which is making pleasure very contemporary.
Okay.
Making pleasure a very sort of recent-ish phenomenon. And by recent-ish, I almost mean like maybe not at my actual birth, but like the kind of community of Black people that I know, the range of ages that they represent. So, you know, if my grandmother when she was living was the oldest, born in 1918, you know, it's like, oh, well, pleasure must start at 1918. But I think that really it was Catherine Clay Bassard's work that kind of got me thinking about the relationship between Wheatley and Ober Tanner. And it was clearly, at least to me, a friendship. And I think that where there's a friendship, there's the possibility of pleasure. There's the possibility of, you know, sharing and like the enjoyment that comes out of that. And I think kind of Audre Lorde's work at the time was particularly useful to me as well, thinking about kind of the uses of the erotic. And, you know, I think that once I took seriously the fact that Wheatley and Tanner have this friendship, then I think I realized that it wasn't just them as some kind of anomaly, but there are other places where kind of the language of pleasure shows up. And I think that there's a diversity of pleasures. You know, that's why the title is plural. So I'm not necessarily advocating for like, oh, you know, these 4 Black writers feel good in one particular way, but instead, you know, kind of represent both the possibility and also like how the various and different ways they felt good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad so much that you took this path. I mean, because I think it gives us fresh readings in some ways, new ways of looking at these authors. You know, as the historian on this call, I did think a little bit about, you know, the kind of work over the last few decades on the recovery, the scholarly recovery of the history of emotions, you know, which has, which makes an argument, I think, often that that emotions are constructed by the communities and both externally and internally, and that they themselves have a history. I'm trying to square that a little, that maybe its influence on you with your confession of using sort of contemporary approaches. Does pleasure have a history? Is that a useful way of sort of thinking? Was this an influence, I guess, or?
Yeah, I think that almost before we get to the kind of long history of emotions, I guess I wanted to just kind of acknowledge in a public way that these were 4 Black people who represented their good feelings too.
Yep.
And they didn't represent them to me because I was somehow doing some special reading practice, but instead was just willing to take seriously the fact that they talk about feeling good, you know? So I think about, I guess, where my work would fit into this history of emotion. I almost think that I'm one step before thinking about the actual arc of that history, because I think that when it comes to early African-American writing, there has not been nearly as much engagement from the kind of literary scholar side of the conversation about ways to read the good feeling in these texts. And I think this is where like the disciplinary divide becomes really important, though, I think I can make arguments about my interdisciplinarity, but the approach is definitely one that is much more literary in its sensibilities than historically minded. And I think that in that way, the emphasis for me had to just be on saying, hey, Phillis Wheatley has a friend, and together they suggest that they sometimes have a good time. And, kind of moving through each author with that kind of, basic presumption, like, hey, here are these 2 Black men that love God and God makes them feel good. Let's kind of acknowledge that. Like, David Walker is angry and also kind of imagines the joy that comes after the anger, so I think that, yeah, before I can put myself into that history of emotion, I think I had a much simpler task in mind, which was to say, hey, let's look at these canonical writers and like see them from a different angle. And also wonder, if we look at them from a different angle, how might this influence our ability to look for, find, and also read other early Black writers too?
Feels sort of like we need to remember their humanity before we historicize their humanity.
I think that's kind of it. And not necessarily be like wholly afraid of representing the complexity of that humanity either. Because I know that, and I know this in part because people have questioned me in this way. I know that no one wants to kind of go down some sort of stereotype-based happy slave, like line of thinking. And that's certainly not what I'm interested in doing. But I think that there still needs to be an engagement with all of the many ways that Black people are figuring out how to live that isn't just resistance. So I guess what I'm doing as adding to the conversation about resistance as opposed to replacing it. Like, yeah. So that's my thought.
So Wheatley, Marrant, Gronniosaw, Walker. Were there other individuals, Tanner, of course, who I think in many ways is, equally part of this story. Were there other individuals that you had auditioned maybe for being part of this? Or did you sort of know that this is where these were the ones who were going to help you start to really make some of the points you wanted to make?
I think I knew that this was my core group.
Okay.
I think that what I did not know, I will say, is that Tanner becomes a larger point of interest.
Yep.
I think that Tanner might be my surprise kind of to myself a little bit. And I think that kind of Tanner's role is one that has become increasingly important to my thinking. And in that way, I would say that she is probably the one who, if I took another 10 years to write this book, would figure larger than she does currently.
So for our readers or our watchers at home who haven't had a chance to read this yet, you wanted to say a few things about the kind of 4 people you chose and what you're trying to do with them. I realized that this was the kind of standard talk, slide 1, Wheatley, slide 2, Marrant. But, what was briefly kind of the most interesting things about each of them that you were really looking to pull forward?
So I think, as I said, all 4 of them are canonical, some more than others, but I guess what I mean by that in part is that they have been anthologized. They have kind of poems, narratives, sermons, appeals that can be easily accessed, either kind of can be purchased easily or can be found digitally very easily. So that to me felt important. Like, I did not want to pick hard to find folks, but instead wanted to make this argument about Black writers who would be, familiar, certainly within the discipline, and also maybe familiar to a wider audience as well. So Phillis Wheatley, kind of leads the charge as the one of the earliest writers in the book, but also as the one that is most well known. And I think that what was important to me about Wheatley was the letters. I think that there's a way to kind of read her poems anew, which is, what I tried to do a little bit, but really what I find most compelling about Wheatley are her letters, and in particular, those letters to Uber Tanner. And what makes them so interesting is that they really do kind of speak to their friendship, and the friendship where, they are revealing, they're sharing, they are excited to hear from one another. And that's kind of represented, even though the letters that are extant are just from Wheatley to Tanner, I think it's still clear that there's a real exchange there. And, I think that kind of opened up for me, the very possibility that I had completely misunderstood so many things about early America, about Black people in early America. Like, it was eye-opening to kind of go to the back of my Penguin edition and to look at the letters that have been Synchoretta published in Wheatley's complete writings. So then we have John Marrant and James Albert Ukawsaw Gronniosaw, and they are both writing conversion narratives, and they, I think, are doing a very interesting work with these conversion narratives. Like, at base, what they're identifying is that their love and appreciation for their Christian God. And I think that, there's a way to kind of talk about the influence of Christianity on kind of early Black Americans, and to make Christianity kind of the tool of the oppressor. But I think that both these narratives kind of suggest a very real sort of love and affection for God that then allows for so many other opportunities in the lives of these men. The narratives are not exactly the same. They're very different things that happen. And yet what is consistent in both of them is that they kind of use the Bible to represent their own life stories and to make sense of their own life stories. And I think that there's something very joyful to them about the possibility of having a God who can save them, a God that can support them, a God that can affirm them. And I think that is kind of key to their story, and also like a real challenge to, I think mid 20th century and later ideas of how Christianity works, and who Christianity is for. Then there's David Walker, who writes this appeal in 1829. He's my 19th century interloper, I like to say. But he, is known for his very well articulated anger. He's got all these pointed fingers. He's got all these exclamation marks. Like, it is clear that David Walker is angry about slavery. It is clear that he is angry about what he calls the wretched condition of his brethren, kind of the Black people of the world as he identifies them. And he also knows that with anger, he can mobilize them to action. And that action will ultimately yield a very different sort of American landscape. And there's joy that kind of comes from that. So all four of them, as I said before, are offering a very different sort of perspective on what pleasure and good feeling look like. But I think that it is certainly the case, though, that the good feeling is present. The good feeling is somewhat easy to see and is worth talking about.
Really, I think in that description really underscores the plurality of pleasures, right? I mean, I think Walker might be the one that we least expect to find pleasure, but I think there's a real sophistication, right? And maybe wisdom in sort of understanding the good feeling that anger isn't just a totality in itself, right? That there is a pleasure in what drives the anger and also what he envisions the anger can produce, right?
Yeah.
Something, sadly, which as you share with us, he doesn't live to see.
Right.
Yet has set the framework for. The other part of the title, right, is reading. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, what is reading for you? I feel like reading is one of those terms that many of us take for granted. It's something that we do. We might lament the format in which we do it. I used to do it in books, and now the kids do it on their phones. But it might not be something we problematize or even, force ourselves to stop and think about. So when you were thinking about what reading is, what was kind of going on? What were you trying to help us kind of see in a new way?
Well, I think reading worked on multiple levels for me. So, I think that the writers and authors themselves are engaged in reading as an activity. So, you've got Wheatley and Tanner reading each other's letters. You've got Gronniosaw and Marrant reading the Bible. You've got David Walker kind of his book or his pamphlet, his appeal is largely like a bunch of citations in some respects of other of stuff that he's read in order to prove his point, in addition to the fact that he self-publishes. So there's I just imagine him setting the type and the kind of reading and joy that comes with that. But I also kind of thought about myself as a reader too, and the person who is reading these writers and in looking for their pleasures. So I think that it is an observation and also a directive. It's the observation of me observing them as they read. And I think it also is a director to my imagined reader to let's read for these pleasures. And maybe that's the directive of the authors back to us too, to make sure that we see the pleasure alongside of the many other things that we might find in their work.
I'm curious if you ever felt you had to retrain yourself to read. And I guess I'm struck by the quote on page 13, where you say, reading then demands a listening in, a sounding out, an attention to the in-between, and what's left unsaid yet speaks as a gesture, an interruption, or a misplaced word. Is that something you were trained to do, or is that something you kind of learned to do in dialogue with these works?
Well, you know, I mean, I'm willing to give credit to the fact that I did earn a PhD. So, you know, I'm gonna say that, you know, the good folks at Johns Hopkins might have taught me a thing or two. Um, but I also think that there's something about kind of going back in time in this way that let me know that I had to get past my assumptions about what was possible. And I think that's kind of the lesson of the text themselves. Because I kept coming up against my own sort of like, oh, I didn't think they could do this, or oh, I didn't think that oh, I didn't. And, you know, I think I guess I had to train myself to get curious, you know, get curious about my own assumptions and the origin of those assumptions, but also get curious about the text themselves and I ask better questions, you know. So, I mean, I think that one of the go-tos when it comes to kind of African American literature before like 1865 is to ask where, you know, the writer learns to read and write.
Mhm.
And oftentimes there's not an answer to that. So that ends up not being the best question. And yet that's often the first question. So it's like, well, how do I break myself of that habit and instead look for what is actually present in the text and, you know, pursue the questions that the text allows me to ask. And sure, you know, I'm nosy, so I want to find my own questions, but I think that part of my own reading practice had to change around the types of questions that I asked in order to kind of break down my presumptions and actually like read what was there in the work.
You and I have both spent a lot of time in reading rooms, and now I have the great pleasure of getting to run a fantastic reading room. And I feel like we both can remember far more people who come in for an afternoon and have 10 boxes that they're feverishly trying to get through versus the person who comes in and asks for 3 letters, right? And I mean, I
Yeah.
think what I really, really loved about what you're doing here is saying like, maybe it's more historians that would do this, you know, break yourself of just having to fly through looking for keywords or looking for evidence of what you're expecting to find and just be like, hit the brakes, you know,
Yeah.
stop and really immerse yourself. And yeah, and I know, right? I'm saying do close reading, right? but
Yeah.
but this is such testament to what comes from doing that work, I think. And
Well, and I think that you know, our I think projects have a variety of ends in mind, you know. And so I think that there's some times where let's move quickly through has its place. I also think that there's a place for slowing down and sitting with and kind of returning again and again. And you know, I think sometimes too, like going down random rabbit holes, you know, like I can't get enough of the Brown family business records right now, you
okay.
know. Yeah, I wish Nicholas Brown had better handwriting, but I'm in it, you know. And I think that there's like a yeah, it's something magical too about like pursuing those rabbit holes and having the conversations like I did with Kim Nusko at the John Carter Brown Library yesterday that, you know, might take me somewhere that I had not quite anticipated, but it still may lead to yeah, another set of questions that may work to help me better understand, you know, what it is that I'm actually looking at, what, you know, the set of questions that I'm actually pursuing. And I think that that's kind of the fun of this kind of time travel too, you know. But the hard part is that it takes time. You know, I if I think about it in one way, like I started writing this book 20 years ago. And 20 years is a long time. So, you know, I don't know that I want my next book to take that long. So I understand reading quickly, you know. But I think that there is a time and space for the slow process.
your students appear multiple times as interlocutors in this book. I would say that not every scholar is so readily willing to admit how the classroom shapes their scholarship. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what it means to involve your students in your scholarship.
Well, I think my students, and I've had, many over these years, I think the fun thing about the students for me as I have, kind of pursued the writing of this book is I think that they've helped me understand at different times, like how important the work is to me and why the work is so valuable. So there's a pig roast receipt that I show my classes sometimes. And it's from Caesar Linden's Sundry Account Book. And I showed it to one class. And one of the students was like, you know what? I think the people in this, on this page are about to die. And I was like, what? And I showed it to them, but hadn't offered them context yet. And I was like, no, they're not gonna die. And I explained that, it's just Black people having a barbecue. And because it is set in 1766 on a Tuesday in August, like that student had no way of understanding how that could be or why that would be possible. And, I think that was one of those moments for me of like, this is why I do the work. And do the work of kind of telling these stories. I think that it's easy to forget sometimes how much we are propelled by stories just as human beings. That's how we talk to one another. I think that's one way to understand the conversation that you and I are having right now is that we are, trading stories to some extent. And I think that the stories of the past ultimately inform our stories at present. So, I think every opportunity to help students understand that like Black joy doesn't start in the 21st century with a hashtag, right. Or, any opportunity to kind of help complicate their understanding of kind of Black people across time. It's one that I jump at, and I actually have no choice. I have to do it because every semester there's an opportunity for me to drive this point home.
I mean, it's fascinating here to think about that, that Black joy didn't start in the 21st century, but also the very, I think, powerful ways you lean into how the Black Lives Matter movement helps us also realize that's also not a 21st century creation, right? And you talk in your introduction, you say reading as if and because their Black Lives Matter lends me a critical generosity that is willing to imagine that Wheatley, Marrant, Gronniosaw, and Walker matter to themselves and those who love and know them. This living bears witness to the kind of materiality that not only accepts a collective or individual humanity as fact, but also the pleasures that emit to what matters to their lives. And is there a blind spot, in the way we've approached by not thinking about how all of their, the full complexity of their lives matter, right? That it's not just one, way in that this book needs to do a certain kind of work to push back against?
I think that the importance of kind of Black Lives Matter as like a phrase, like dawned on me in some respects, because I think it very usefully to me, like summarizes the project, I think that is ultimately what it is that I am trying to demonstrate, is that each of these authors has a person or a community in mind as they are writing. And built into that is like a very real sense of the community's relationship to them and affirming them, and also like their relationship to the community or the person that they are like also like wanting to affirm. And I think in all of the instances, like what I have in mind is that that other person or that community is comprised of Black people. And I think that as the writing was picking up speed for me, Black Lives Matter was emerging. And, I think that I certainly understand it to be a statement of the obvious, just as, a Black person, I feel like, oh, my life matters. And there are people who tell me that. So that's a good thing. But I think that, in a kind of anachronistic way, I sort of wondered, like, does that have to start with me? I don't, or does it have to start with my students? Or is this something that could have, like an idea that was known, even if those three words weren't linked together? And I think that that's kind of what emerged from the writing for me. It was like, yes, they matter because they all are children of God. They matter because there's someone with whom to correspond. They matter because, someone like David Walker is willing and wanting to publish an appeal that like ultimately transforms the American landscape in so many different ways. Like, yeah.
Well, we've got some great questions coming into the chat. I realize that I've got a long list of questions, but I'm going to let other voices in. So Lois Levine writes, thank you for speaking to the value of slow scholarship to generate deeper engagement and understanding, as well as nodding to the unknowability of what these texts and their authors may refuse to reveal to us, despite how curious we are. The kind of early pleasure you talk about, especially in correspondence like Wheatley and Tanner's, also happens at a slower pace. In our immediate gratification culture, what do you think we, not just scholars, but also the broader public, might take from this model of slow-paced pleasure as a valued early Black experience?
I think that the slow pace and just slowing down, which is hard to do, of course. Like, I mean, I got all kinds of machinery around me right now. And I'm sure we all do. I think that the slow pace just allows one to see so much more and hear so much more and kind of engage all of the senses. I think I keep coming back to the John Carter Brown Library because I was there yesterday. But at some point, kind of flipping through Nicholas Brown's letters, I thought about the weight of the paper, and I kept getting frustrated by his handwriting. And I thought about the ink in the quill pen. I was like, was his pen dull? Like, why is it? It's so messy. But I think that slowing down is ultimately what the mind needs to wrestle with whatever it has to deal with. And I think that's always the case. So even though we've got fancy phones and fancy computers and tablets, et cetera, like our mind is still the same kind of human mind that it was in 1773 or 1785 or 1915. And I think it sometimes needs to slow down. So yeah, I think we can all benefit from slowing down just a smidgen.
We, of course, are the Congregational Library, and we were joking a little bit about this before we turned on the program. Ober Tanner is part of the First Congregational Church in Newport. Phillis Wheatley is, and then after her marriage as well, part of the Old South Congregation up here in Boston. Was there ever a time where Tanner's support and participation in the kind of congregation of Hopkins and Samuel Hopkins' kind of theological mindset was starting to come in? When you think about sort of tackling Tanner and you tackle Wheatley, how far out do you go for the context and how far do you stay within, I guess, the letters themselves? Like, did you become an expert on the New Divinity movement or any of that to understand what they were doing?
Well, not as much for this book.
Okay.
What I do think is interesting is that not for this book. So what strikes me as like so compelling. And I think what is gonna drive me deeper into Congregationalism and New Divinity, et cetera, is Uber Tanner keeps those letters for 50 some odd years. So the extant letters are from 1772 to 1779. And Uber Tanner dies in 1835. And excuse me, I felt that coming. So Tanner dies in 1835, and in the 1830s, she gives her letters to Catherine Eads Beecher. And I think in the way that happens, and this is the benefit of the slow reading process, I hadn't wondered who Catherine Eads Beecher was enough. And with some digging, I found out that she is William Henry Beecher's wife. And William Henry Beecher was pastor of First Congregational Church in the 1830s. So in fact, Tanner gives the letters to her pastor's wife. So I think that there's an interest in something that is beginning to emerge for me about kind of the Congregational Church as an important site of like memory and holding on to things for Tanner. I don't know at this point, like why she makes that exact choice, but I think it is key that she decides to leave these letters with her pastor's wife, like not just any old body, but her pastor's wife in particular. And I think that to me speaks to the importance of that church that she got baptized in 1768. So between 1768 and 1830, she's still going to the First Congregational Church, despite the Revolutionary War, and all subsequent wars between then and 1830 and other sorts of, I'm sure, life happenings as well. So I don't necessarily have all the answers yet, but there's a conversation for me and a set of questions that are emerging that kind of, connect First Congregational Church and Second Congregational Church in Newport to folks like Wheatley.
Yeah, absolutely. In our question, there's a recommendation about looking at Lemuel Haynes,
who
is the first ordained African-American congregational minister, Granville, Massachusetts, and then up in Vermont. Probably a bit more like Marrant in being more published, although you can find through our New England Hidden History a bunch of materials related to him, letters that he wrote back to his congregation. So I encourage folks to check those out. Has he ever been on your radar, or?
He's been on my radar, but has not made it quite into the fold. I think that instead of going further north, I have become recently obsessed with Newport, Rhode Island. So, maybe one day I'll make it to Vermont, but right now I'm steeped in deep with Newport, Rhode Island, and Providence too.
Fantastic, and just such fantastic stuff going on down there. Our hope is that the New England's Hidden History Project, which does work to digitize church records from the 17th, 18th, and early 19th century, will be working with Rhode Island Historical and hopefully Newport Historical in future grants to bring those materials forward, because not everybody can afford to get there. Not everyone, even when they can get there, not everyone can read cursive handwriting anymore. So the work that we do of scanning and digitizing and transcribing, hopefully just allows other people to kind of do these slow reads. Although, sitting in a reading room at Newport Historical is in itself an experience. I have always been amazed by what you do with the archive. So, I've been a fanboy of yours for a long time. And the way you take, and in some ways I feel like maybe more of the talks I've seen you do are on the more mundane things that survive, the pig roast receipt. I hadn't heard about the John Brown account books, but I wonder if you just talk a little bit about, the pleasure that you find in the archive, and what keeps, what you'll come up here and you'll sit and boxes are brought out. Where is
Yeah.
the pleasure? What is the pleasure for you?
I think the pleasure in many ways comes from like the time travel, like actually going back in time by way of looking at the stuff and holding the stuff. We did you and I did a summer at the American Antiquarian Society, I think 400 years ago. And, I think at that time, I had not fully immersed myself in all that the archive had to offer. I think I did not think of it as a tool, and because I had the good fortune of being at a school that subscribed to the digital collection. It's like, well, if it's digitized, boom, why do I need to go anywhere? And I've matured since then. I was a graduate student. I'm better now. But I think that what I didn't understand then and what I better understand now has to do with the materiality of the text. It has to do with like actually being able to, I feel like, teleport, so as I'm looking through those letters that I keep referencing, there's a lot of spermaceti, and, I think for the moment, just wondering, like, even more about the spermaceti oil, what's it doing? Where's it going? Like, there's all these mentions of Suriname, like, what does Providence in 1776 actually look like? Why are there so many ships in that harbor? And ultimately, I'm trying to ask this question so I can figure out like what the landscape looks like for Wheatley and Tanner and this kind of Black community that I'm also obsessed with. Like, where do they fit into this as this war is happening, as the British have Navy ships in kind of the Newport Harbor, which is ultimately on the way to Providence too. Like, all of it works together. So I think that's the joy I get, simply put, I think has to do with the time travel and the opportunity to kind of like see, feel, hear, touch, touch the past and to like imagine it and bring it to life so that we present day can make sense of it.
Yeah. I think there's so much that is, it's a cliche to say the past is a foreign country, quoting Santayana, but it is so much the truth. Maybe as a sort of final question, it's these 50 minutes have kind of like flown right by. Maybe coming back to how you situate yourself in the work. I love it. I will say that when I finished reading the coda on Tanner, I longed to be in a classroom to teach that, right? Because I think it's a chapter where you and Tanner are almost in dialogue, right? That it's you're there. And I think the way you allow your reader to see your active reflection on the process of understanding these, right? The way you open yourself up, and make yourself vulnerable, in some ways. You don't have to be the authority or the gatekeeper on knowledge about Tanner. At one point you comment, if I'm to read or learn about Tanner's life, I have to accept what she can and will never tell me. I think that in itself is a brave statement, because I think a lot of us in grad school are taught, don't stop, just keep going. And I think that has to be sort of tough, right? Respecting the limits placed by the historical subject. And I'm curious if you feel that we're doing enough as scholars to think about why we ask the questions that we do. And are we respectful of the silences that or the limits that they place on our ability to understand them?
I think that there are times when I wish there was more conversation about the fact that, historical subjects may not be interested in having us tell their stories. I and have been wondering more recently, like where that kind of mind your business line is. Is this my business? Or is this the business of someone else? And, I think that, as I said before, we're driven by stories. So, I certainly like wonder about this while also in pursuit of the story. I haven't figured out a way to kind of adequately get around that. But I think that it, to me, feels worth at times like talking about the fact that there are some things that we can't know, and maybe we're not supposed to know. And I almost wish there was more opportunities either for that to be okay, or even more opportunities to dive more deeply into the truth of that.
Thank you so much, Tara, for being with us today. Now that I know that you've been in the New England region, I might need to hop on a train next time you're going to be down.
Absolutely.
So,
thank you so much for the opportunity to talk about this book, to talk about this work. There's a lot more that I have to figure out when it comes to the kind of congregational church. So I'm certain to be in touch.
Excellent. Well, we're here, open 9 to 5, 5 days a week, not 7. So, all right, take care, everyone. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.